There have been a lot of Pokémon games over the years, and I mean a lot. From dozens upon dozens of mainline titles spanning multiple generations to an even bigger pile of spin-offs, basically across every platform you can think of, Pokémon has been absolutely everywhere for about 3 decades now. We've had massive spin-offs that became household names in their own right, games like Pokémon Go, Pokémon Unite, and of course the Mystery Dungeon series. Some of these spin-offs are so popular that for a lot of people, they are the Pokémon games. And honestly, that makes sense. To me, my Pokémon games are Pokémon Ranger. Anyway, Pokémon is the highest grossing media franchise of all time, so of course it's going to experiment, branch out, and try a million different ideas. But then, when you have that many games, some of them are inevitably going to fall through the cracks, and that's what we're here to talk about today. This video isn't about the most successful Pokémon spin-offs or even the best ones. Instead, we're taking a look at Pokémon spin-off games that have largely been forgotten, games that people don't really talk about anymore, or maybe never even knew existed in the first place. Some of these are from the early days, but others are surprisingly recent. They've just been quietly brushed under the rug over time. So there's no ranking here, no order, this is just a curated list of forgotten Pokémon spin-offs that I think are interesting, weird, or even historically important in their own way. These games range across mobile, PC, and multiple console generations. And just to add, we're not looking at any arcade Pokémon games for today because honestly, that probably deserves an entire video of its own. Anyway, with that out the way, let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with what is probably the most niche entry on this entire list. Seriously, if you're watching this and thinking, I have never heard of this in my life, don't worry, that is kind of the point. Pokémon Garden is a fascinating and extremely obscure Pokémon spin-off. It was a browser-based Flash game released in 2006, and it existed specifically to bridge the gap between Generation 3 and Generation 4. This wasn't just some throwaway minigame either. Pokémon Garden featured multiplayer connectivity, various minigames, and a surprising amount of behind-the-scenes content. Most notably, it included exclusive teasers for Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, which hadn't released yet at the time. So in a way, Pokémon Garden functioned as both a social game and a marketing platform. The footage you're seeing on screen right now actually comes from a press kit that was discovered relatively recently. And that alone is kind of wild because Pokémon Garden was Japan only and existed entirely as a Flash game, meaning it was never really meant to be preserved long term. And that's where things get really interesting. Because Pokémon Garden relied on Flash, restoring it today is an absolute nightmare. The only way to recover the original game files is to find computers that still have the game stored in their browser cache. From back in 2006. Let that sink in for just a moment. That means that we've got to find someone who played Pokémon Garden in Japan in 2006 on a computer that somehow still exists with its browser cache still intact. That is an absolutely insane preservation challenge. And yet, somehow, people are actually doing it. Pokémon Garden is currently in the process of being restored, which is honestly incredible. This kind of digital archaeology is so important, especially for games that were never meant to survive past their original release window. If you want a much deeper dive into Pokémon Garden, including unused files, development details, and why it mattered, I highly recommend checking out Did You Know Gaming's video on the subject. There is so much cool stuff in there, and if you're a fan of the series, it is absolutely worth your time. Now, just before we move on to our next game, if you're a fan of Pokémon or obscure video games, then please consider hitting subscribe and tapping the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. It's greatly appreciated. Anyway, let's move on. So next up is a game that looks like a goofy educational side project, but is actually a bit more interesting than it first appears. Learn with Pokémon Typing Adventure, released during the Generation 5 era, and while it looks like a simple PC typing game, it's actually a full Nintendo DS title. The game was developed by Genius Sonority. Yes, that Genius Sonority is in the guys behind Pokémon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, and originally launched in Japan in 2011, followed by a European release in mid-2012. However, it never made its way to America at all. The core idea is simple: you travel through different routes and environments, encounter Pokémon, and catch them by correctly typing their names. That's it. That's literally the game. But, in my eyes, here's the really cool part. Typing Adventure came bundled with a physical DS keyboard peripheral. And not some cheap, weird afterthought either. This thing, to me at least, looks surprisingly sleek, looks oddly professional, and is probably one of the strangest official Nintendo accessories ever made. Now today, of course, that keyboard and game fetches a fairly high price on sites like eBay, because it's become a collector's item almost entirely due to how niche it is. In terms of reception, it never received a Metacritic score, but on the now defunct game rankings it held a 69 out of 100. It sold fairly well in Japan, especially considering its unusual concept. And there were actually two versions released in Japan, a white keyboard released alongside Pokémon Black and White, and a black keyboard released later to match Black 2 and White 2. The white version was estimated to have sold about 216,000 copies, while the black version only sold 43,000, likely due to the much later release timing. Fun fact, this was actually the first Generation 5 Pokémon spin-off, which makes it a pretty interesting starting point for that era. Now we move on to a game that introduced the world to, well, everyone's favourite versions of everyone's favourite legendary Pokémon. Yes, I am indeed talking about Pokémon Dream Radar, the game responsible for the Therian forms of Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus. And listen, I don't know about you, but I've never once heard someone say the Therian forms are my favourite legendaries, but credit where it's due, I guess. The concept itself was actually pretty neat. Dream Radar was a 3DS exclusive spin-off released during Generation 5, and it used augmented reality technology. The idea was that you were studying the Inter-Dream Zone and needed to collect dream orbs for research. To do that, you'd physically move your 3DS around your environment, using a beam to destroy dream clouds and capture Pokémon that appeared in real-world space. Nintendo was really pushing AR tech around this time, and while of course we all know it didn't exactly stick long term, it was still a fun experiment. What makes Dream Radar especially weird is that it technically connects to Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, but it launched on the 3DS, while Black 2 and White 2 were still DS games, and the final mainline Pokémon titles on that system no less. So it's a Gen 5 spin-off, on Gen 6 hardware, connecting back to the DS era. A little bit odd, if you ask me. Critically, Dream Radar landed squarely in the middle. The game holds a 54 out of 100 on Metacritic, and unfortunately, because the 3DS eShop is now shut down, the game is effectively lost unless you already own it or have other ways of acquiring it. Which is honestly pretty sad because it's such a uniquely weird little piece of Pokémon history. So moving on, everyone knows Pokémon Mystery Dungeon. It's one of the most beloved Pokémon spin-off series ever made. But what a lot of people don't know is that there were 3 Mystery Dungeon games released exclusively in Japan. Yes, that's right, 3. These were, and these are translated titles, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Let's Go Stormy Adventure Squad, Go For It Light Adventure Squad, and Keep Going Blazing Adventure Squad. Each version focused primarily on water, electric, or fire type Pokémon respectively. These games were released on August 4th, 2009, and were Wii Shop channel exclusives, meaning they were digital only, Japan only, and never released anywhere else in the world. The footage you're seeing now comes from a fan-made English port that took a lot of work, which is honestly incredible to see. There are a few really interesting things about these games. They use the same 3D Pokemon models as Pokemon Rumble and My Pokemon Ranch. You could use a Nintendo DS as a controller if you so desired, and they introduced a new mechanic called Pokemon Tower, where Pokemon could ride on top of each other to perform powerful multi-attacks. Yes, I just said Pokemon riding each other, and yes, we are moving on immediately. These games were lighter on story compared to other Mystery Dungeon entries, but they were still packed with charm. Across the 3 versions, there were 27 Pokemon that you could play as, with 9 per game. While most were fire, water, or electric types, there were a few oddities like Togepi and Meowth. It's genuinely a shame that these never left Japan. If this had been available on the Wii worldwide, I would have sunk absolutely hundreds of hours into it as a kid. Unfortunately, like Dream Radar, these games are now unobtainable through official means due to the Wii Shop's closure. You know the rest. You know what to do. So next up is My Pokemon Ranch, and whether you consider this a spin-off game or just an accessory is entirely up for the debate. But for the purposes of this video, I'm calling it a spin-off. Developed by Umbrella, My Pokemon Ranch released worldwide in 2008 on the Wii. Umbrella is known exclusively for making Pokemon games, though, unfortunately, not really the strongest ones. Their early catalogue entries include Hey You Pikachu, Pokemon Channel, and Pokemon Dash. So My Pokemon Ranch functioned primarily as a Pokemon storage system for Diamond and Pearl, but it actually had a little more depth than you might first expect. As you stored more Pokemon, your ranch would level up, unlocking new features and missions called Wanted Pokemon. These missions encouraged players to complete their Pokédex by suggesting Pokemon you hadn't caught yet and explaining exactly how to obtain them, including evolution requirements, item locations, and pre-evolutions. Eventually, completing these missions allowed you to obtain a level 50 Phione, is that how it's pronounced? And a level 50 Mew, making this one of the few legitimate ways to obtain Mew at the time. Interestingly, in late 2008, the game received an update in Japan that added compatibility with Pokémon Platinum. That update never released outside of Japan, and the game was never compatible with Heart Gold or Soul Silver at all. So once again, regional differences and digital storefront closures have turned this into a half-lost piece of Pokemon history. I personally actually still have this installed on my Nintendo Wii, and still have some of my Diamond and Pearl Pokemon on there from back in like 2007, so after I'm done making this video, I'm definitely going to hop back on and pay them a visit, and who knows, maybe I'll get that level 50 Mew one day. Now for our final game, we are talking about Pokémon Quest. And I know what you're thinking, but Kledge, Pokémon Quest isn't forgotten. And yeah, you're right, kind of. What is forgotten is that Pokémon Quest has a much larger and more content-rich version in China. For anyone unfamiliar, Pokémon Quest is a free-to-play game released on mobile and Nintendo Switch, set on Tumble Cube Island. You explore, battle wild Pokémon, and build a team, all presented in a blocky voxel-style art direction. Your Pokémon move automatically, but you choose when they use moves, and there's also an auto mode. It's very much a mobile game because, well, it is one. The Chinese version, however, is mobile only and contains many more generations, far more content, and ongoing updates. The international version only includes Generation 1, which makes the Chinese release feel like an entirely different game. You can technically play the Chinese version outside China, but setting it up is a process. There are Reddit guides, but you definitely want to be careful. The game continued to receive updates all the way through to middle of 2024, and Pokémon Quest was discontinued in China in February 2025. But there definitely will still be ways to play. Like I say, head over to Reddit, guys. Anyway, it's a real shame we never got that expanded version worldwide. Pokémon Quest isn't exactly groundbreaking, but it's charming, fun in short bursts, and genuinely nice to look at. And that brings us to the end of today's look at some more of the forgotten Pokémon spin-offs. Every game here could easily deserve its own video, especially Pokémon Quest and the Japan exclusive Mystery Dungeon titles, but for now, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications, all the usual YouTube stuff. It genuinely helps out more than you might think. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thanks and goodbye.